Hi, and welcome to our second week of January. So, as I said last week, I'm going to experiment with dyeing laces. So, as you can see in front of me here, I've got a pile of different laces. I've got a few scraps of fabric as well, and I've also got some cheesecloth, which is that sort of big pile of netting there on the right. So I've got my four dyes. I originally had two, the two green ones, and then I decided to buy a dark brown one and a blue one. And then I bought these squirty bottles, which I have filled with about 30 mils, or I think it's 10 ounces, of very warm. So the water was boiled and it's only just cooled down, water with lots of salt in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill the rest of the bottle with the dye. So there'll be about 20 mils or 15 mils of dye, 15 to 20 approximately, and about 30 mils of the warm water. Now, one thing I did forget to add, which I was supposed to add to my water, was a squirt of dishwashing liquid. And I totally forgot to do that, and that's what it said to do on the packet. Now, I'm not following the exact recipe that Rit suggested, because their recipe was using the whole bottle and like 3 gallons of water, and I don't even know how much 3 gallons is, because we don't work in gallons, we work in liters and mils. So I'm just experimenting here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 2 bottles in the green dye just as they are. Then you'll see I'm not going to do a full navy blue bottle. I'm going to do a splash of navy blue and then add a bit more of the dark green, just to get another slightly bluey shade of green. And then I'm going to use the brown, but I do decide to water the brown down. So I've got a little funnel to get it into the bottle, as you can see. And the instructions say you need to shake the Rit dye, and then obviously you're adding it to the warm water. I did forget to shake the brown one. It's a bit gloopy, and that's because I forgot to shake it, which I didn't realise until after. So I'll be dyeing my laces in a minute. All right, now I'm up to my fourth colour. So this is the one where I'm going to add just a little bit of the navy blue. I can't say exactly how many mils. I just do a dash. You'll see it's just a dash, and then I fill the rest up with the green. Oh, I have to say sorry about the camera wobbles. I'm actually outside filming, and it's a nice day outside, but it's become a little bit breezy this afternoon, and my iPad is on a very flexible kind of wobbly arm, and the wind keeps blowing it a little bit. So sorry if I'm giving you motion sickness, but I've got my 4 colours here. And now we're going to start the dyeing process. So this is totally experimental, and we'll see how they turn out. Now I've just got a baking tray with some, we call it baking paper. I think maybe it's called parchment paper overseas. It's just like a non-stick paper that you use for baking. And I'm just laying down, so these are all of this that I'm putting on this tray, it's all old except for the cheesecloth. So they're all old or some vintage, some are probably even antique laces. Most of them are made out of cotton. There's one that's got a bit of a sheen to it. I don't know what that's made out of. It could be something synthetic. But the dyes that I'm using are actually an all-purpose dye. So they do lots of different types of fabrics. So hopefully the colour comes out well on all the different types of laces. Okay, I've almost got all my laces laid out. That brownie one, so actually a few of those laces there I've tea dyed before, particularly that one at the top's quite dark. So that'll be interesting to see what effect the tea dyeing and then the Rit dyeing has on the lace. So this that I'm about to lay out is, we call it cheesecloth. I'm not sure if it's called anything else. You usually use it for cooking. I just buy it at like a dollar store that we have here. And then with the squirty bottles, I don't want them all to be just sort of one colour. So I want them to be a bit mottledy, because, you know, I might want to cut this bit out or that bit out. So a bit variegated. So I'm just randomly squirting the different shades of dye So I've done the two base greens there, and this one now is the bluey green where I've added a bit of the navy blue dye, and then I'll add a few squirts of the brown, and then I will go over the top with the lighter green dye. Actually refill the bottle with more water so it will lighten up the dye a little bit further, or dilute it a little bit further, which I think I'm doing now. Yes, I'm going to fill that up with some more of the warm salty water, and then I just empty that all over the lace, because some of the ones underneath haven't quite picked up the dye, which you'll see in a minute when I start moving them around. So it's a bit of a camouflage effect really, isn't it? But we'll see what happens once they dry. I'm letting them dry, they're out in the sun drying at the moment, and then I'm going to rinse them to get the excess dye off, just with a bit of dishwashing liquid in warm sort of soapy water, and then I'll re-dry them again, and they should dry up a little bit lighter than, they're looking quite dark on the screen right now, but I don't think they'll end up that way. Anyway, hopefully not, fingers crossed. So I'm just moving all the bits of laces and fabric around a bit. You can see there's bits like that one there that hasn't quite picked up enough colour, so I'm rubbing it into the dye that's on the parchment paper or baking paper, and then I'm going to put a little bit more water on just to make sure they're all saturated in dye. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop them into a new container so that I can put them out into the sun to dry. Alright, so they're looking pretty good. They're nice and saturated in the dye. So I'm putting them into that container. And once I've let them dry, rinse them and let them dry again, I'm going to come back very shortly on this video. You'll see what the end result is, and hopefully they look good. Alright, so drying done. Now we're going to look at the results. So just firstly, with my method, what happened was I did leave it out in the sun, and the plan was to fully let it dry, but about maybe half an hour after it was out in the sun, it started to pour. So I had to go outside and bring it in, and what I did is I laid it out on baking paper on a oven tray, the tray that I actually use for the dyeing, and at a very low temperature. I think I had it at about maybe just over 100 degrees Celsius. Not sure what that is Fahrenheit, you can look that up. I slowly let them dry in the oven, and then what I did is that one there actually melted a little bit. I think that was a bit of a synthetic one. I don't know if that piece was actually old, so I'm not going to use that bit. I might use it in something else, but not the project. So what I did is after I let it dry in the oven, then I washed it out, and I kept rinsing it out. I used a little bit of washing detergent, and I kept rinsing it out until the water ran absolutely clear. And then what I did is I dried it again. This time, it was in the oven again actually. So these are the results. So as you can see, there are some different variations of greens, and you can see the bits of brown there, which is the look I was going for. I'm actually really pleased with how they turned out. It was kind of what I was imagining. Now I'm certainly not using all these bits and pieces, but I've got them dyed now, and I can use them in future blocks or future projects that I'm going to do. But you'll see shortly. I'm going to speed this up a bit in a minute, because my video, if I was to let this video play in real time, it would literally be about 4.5 to 5 hours long, for all my filming that I've done for this project, starting with the dyeing all the way through to the end part of the block. So I'm going to speed this up a bit now, just so you can see the last few bits and pieces and how pretty they look, and then you'll see which ones I use. Now most of these bits and pieces, they're all really old vintage pieces. I've actually got loads and loads and loads of vintage laces. The reason I've got so much, not only do I buy them all the time, particularly from the crafty op shop I've told you about, where I often get like meters of it for like 50 cents and $1 and things like that. But we also bought, it was about, at the time, I think it was about 6 boxes, like, and I'm talking big boxes, big plastic tubs of laces and trims and linen napkins and things like that. And they're all really old and vintage because there was this antique store, which is actually not too far from where our mum lives in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. For anyone that's from Australia, they might know that, or Sydney or New South Wales. And the antique store closed down, and we used to love going there because the lady, she had all different types of antiques, but mostly small things. She used to get a lot of vintage linens and embroideries and doilies, which she'd go to the UK, to England, and she'd bring back shipping containers. Anyway, the store closed down, and a friend of ours bought all the stock, and she used a lot of it, and then she had heaps left over, so she sold them to us really cheap. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the layout of my block. So I know I want to use a lot of those hand-dyed vintage laces, so I'm playing around with them to see where I'm going to position them. And I also know that I'm going to use that flower on the side and my bunny. So with layout, there's no particular rule that I follow. I usually get an idea in my head. So with this one, obviously I had the idea of sort of blue for the sky and greens for the bottom. And then I just start to play around with pieces to see what I like the look of. So I sort out my greens at the bottom, and I've got my flower on the side. And then once I've sort of laid that all out, not stitching it straight away, play around with it, moving bits and pieces here and there. Then what I do is I work out if I need to add anything extra. So as you can see, I'm just moving bits around. So I'm 1 minute I think I'm going to have a long piece of something, and then I cut it up short, and then I want a bit of hand-dyed cheesecloth just to give it some texture, etc. So just keep playing until I like the look of it. And even once I thought I had the look down pat, I actually even changed a little bit at the end. Now I feel like I've got the look of the green base the way I want it. Then I start to play around with my bunny to see how I'm going to position it, just moving it around so I can see what angle and where I want to put it. So I kind of want it on a bit of an angle so it looks like it's bouncing. So bouncing bunny. Then I decide that I've got one colourful flower on one side, and I think I need another one on the other side. So I cut out this pretty flower from this fabric here so I can place it on the right hand side towards the top. And now I feel like I've got a better balance for the layout of my feature elements of the flowers and the bunny. The recommendation is once you think you've got your layout the way you want it, take a photo. So when you take everything off, you can come back and look at it and you know where you had things. Okay, so I'm going to start off by stitching my flowers. I'm using this silk thread, which is quite thin. So I'm just looking around to see what I want. So I've pulled out this silk thread, which I like to use for applique. So the type of applique we're doing here is what we call raw edge applique. So this silk thread is super fine. I've got two colours in this. I've got that lighter grey, and then later on I'll be using a darker grey. And they do tend to blend in quite nicely with lots of different fabrics. So I'm just doing what we call a whip stitch. So basically just stitching the edge of that floral fabric down to the background. So I just come up through the 2 layers of fabric, then wrap my needle around the edge, and then bring it up a little further ahead. So it actually makes a little angled stitch. Now it's similar to what we call overcast stitch. which is what I'm going to do once I get around the corner to the next part of the flower. So I'm just going to forward to that bit. So just jumping ahead, you can see I've actually, if you can see there, I've done a little angled stitch the whole way along that edge, holding that piece of floral fabric down to the backing fabrics. So these are just little applique pins. They're made by Clover brand. They're not necessary, you don't have to have them. I just have them from days when I've made quilts. We've done a little bit of applique quilting and things like that. So I'm just pinning my flower in place to make sure that it doesn't move and I stitch it funny. So this time I'm doing an overcast stitch. So I'm coming straight up through the fabric and then back down onto the backing fabric so that I make it a straight line. Now, just with this fabric is an unusual fabric. I'm not exactly sure what type of fabric it is. I'm assuming it's some kind of cotton, but it's quite a thick textured fabric. And as I'm doing this overcast stitching, it does split and I am getting some fibers coming loose. You'll see that particularly up in this top corner it happens, but it does happen on this type of fabric. But doing little stitches, and my stitches are about probably 2 to 3 mils apart, maybe 3 millimeters apart. It will hold it nicely in place. It's not going to come up. And then later on, I'm going to be doing some embroidery on this piece anyway, which will further secure it to the background. So I'm going to cut forward a little bit because this does take quite a while to stitch down. So I'm just about at the end here and I've finished appliquing this flower piece down. Now if this video is too quick for you to watch and to see what I'm doing, there is a function on YouTube where you can actually slow the video down and watch it at a slower pace. So you might want to do that, or you might even want to watch a little bit and then pause and try it yourself and then watch a little bit more. Okay, first flower done, time to do the second. So coming up through the back, I do a couple of stitches to secure it and then just moving forward a little bit, coming around the corner and back up. So you can see coming around the corner and back up. I do the whip stitch on the side. It just naturally goes on an angle. It's easier to do it that way. And then when I get to the other edges which are onto the background and it's not right on the side there, I do the overcast stitch, and the overcast stitch looks straighter. All the stitches are still around 2 to 3 millimeters apart. Alright, stitching around the edge now, doing that overcast stitch. So down through the backing fabric and then straight up, and then moving along in between each stitch. Okay, so I'm just about at the end again, finishing off this last flower, making sure that it's nice and secure to my background. So my flowers are stitched in place, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch one of the green trims, laces, across the bottom. So I want to deliberately hang this one off the bottom of the page so you can see that you can see the light sort of linen through the holes there. That's because I'm hanging it off the page, because I actually want it hanging out the edge of my book. So I want my book to have a lot of sort of trims and laces and my tabs hanging out of the edges, top, bottom, side, whatever. I just want it being very textural, lots of pieces sort of hanging out the edge. So again, I'm just using the overcast stitch to stitch this one down. So coming up from underneath the fabric and then looping it over to the background fabric, going under and then coming up. It's just a straight stitch on the edge. You can also use this stitch when you're piecing together your background. If you didn't want to do your cantha stitching, you can do this stitch around pieces of fabric just to hold them in place, that you might want to embellish later on, or you might want to do a running stitch on them, or whatever you want. But to hold pieces of fabric in place, overcast or the whip stitch are both perfectly suitable to that as well. Alright, so my first green trim is in place, and it's just a little bit long on the end there, I notice. So I am going to trim that one down. Just on the end you can see there's a tiny bit of overlap. So making sure that I check my photo on my phone to try and get my pieces in the same sort of layout that I wanted to before. I select my next piece of lace, and you've just got to look at your different layers. So things that are at the bottom, you'll stitch on first. So the trim across the bottom of my piece is going to be underneath other things, so that got stitched on first. Now to attach all these different pieces of lace, you'll see what I do is I'm just doing little tiny stitches, so it's almost like a little running stitch, just making sure I'm capturing little pieces of the lace so that it holds it down. So there's no particular pattern that I go in. I just make sure I go all around this piece of lace so that it's very firm and secure in place. And you'll see that with all the laces that are coming up, I'll be doing the same thing. So I went all the way across the bottom, up the side, and now I'm going across the top just to make sure I finish it off and it's secure. So after playing around a little bit more with my laces and my cheesecloth, I've decided that I'm going to stitch down these pieces. So I've put them all on, pinned them in place. There's quite a few little bits and pieces there. There's some tulle, there's some other little laces, and I think I put a little bit of cheesecloth in as well. I'm just going to do random little stitches all over these just to keep them in position. So the type of thread that I'm using is that silk thread that I showed you before, but this time I've got one that's a slightly darker grey. It blends in nicely with the green, so you can't even really see the little stitches that I'm doing. You don't have to use a silk thread. You can use any type of thread to stitch down your bits of fabric or your bits of lace. So you could just use a normal sewing machine type of cotton. If you want it to blend in, obviously you'd pick a green tone. I certainly probably wouldn't want to do it in white because the stitches will stand out too much and I don't want to see them. You could also, if you do want to see them, you could use like maybe a stranded cotton or a hand-dyed perle thread. That could look really nice. But for me, I don't want to see the stitches. I just want everything in place and secure, and then I'm going to do some embellishing with embroidery later on, and that's when I use my more interesting threads so you'll be able to see the stitching. Okay, so those laces are all stitched down. Now I'm just going to have a look. I've got some different green sort of trims here, and I pull out a few that I want to put a few bits, a few of these onto my piece to give it more texture. So you'll see what I do with them in a minute. But before I stitch them down, I want to add a little bit more to my background. I love this piece of lace here. I actually used this on my tab in my last video. This time I've dyed it green, and I find a nice little bit that's got some of the brown on it, so it looks nice and earthy, and I just find a position where I want to stitch it down. I've also added in a little bit of extra cheesecloth just underneath it, which I'm going to pin as well. Again, giving it more texture. Alright, so that little bit of extra lace and cheesecloth are now stitched in place. And now I'm going to add a little bit of the blingy trim. This one's a bit sparkly. So stitching it down just in a similar way to how I've stitched everything else, just with little tiny straight stitches. There's sort of a central string on this trim, and I'm making sure that I'm going over that string to keep this piece of thread in place. Okay, now I'm on to another couple of the threads. So I've actually put two together to make it nice and sort of textural, and they're stringy. And same thing again, just stitching over both stems, making sure I'm getting both central stems to hold them in place. So I've stitched down a few of those stringy bits which are going to come under my nice feature elements. So now with these larger feature elements, I'm just doing the same thing, just doing little stitches randomly over the edges just to hold the pieces of lace in place. So I go all the way around these flowers, and then I actually do a few stitches through the middle as well, just to make sure that they're held down. So first feature lace is in place, and now I'm going to sew the second one in place. Same kind of technique, just little stitches over the edge of the lace the whole way around to keep it in place. Okay, so all laces are stitched in place. Now I'm going to position my bunny. Just find the angle that I want my bunny to be on. And then I'm going to do a little overcast stitch to stitch the bunny down as well. So I've appliqued the bunny down onto my backing piece of fabric, and I'll just finish off in a minute and then I'll show you what the layout looks like. So all my bits and pieces are stitched into place. As you can see, my layout is complete. And next week what I'm going to show you is how I will embellish this piece using different types of embroidery, stitching onto those flowers to really make them pop. I might do buttons, beads, sequins, whatever I feel like will work. So that will be the plan for next week. And then the week after that will be the 4th week for this month. My block will be fully completed, and we will be showing you how to attach our blocks into our pages. So that's what we'll be getting done. Remember that these blocks are yours. It is your journal of stitchery, and you have total creative freedom as to how you want to approach this project. So thanks for watching this week, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. See you soon. Bye.